Our topic today is self-managing teams, and this concept, this philosophy, this approach is something that is gaining more attention, I think, in the organizational development world and in the world of leadership and organizational thinking. So we thought it might be a good opportunity just to try and understand a little bit more about what that is, and give ourselves an opportunity to reflect on whether it's appropriate for your team, your organization as a whole. So I am now going to move on into the main body of the webinar. This, in fact, is our third webinar, and we're just really starting to develop our broadcast thinking away from just the blogs, which we've been doing for many years now, and into some of these sorts of webinars and podcasts. So I hope you enjoy our offering today. My plan is to leave a bit of time at the end, 5-10 minutes at least, to enable people to participate in reflections, discussion, examples, anything that you might want to add to what we're offering today. And hopefully you'll find some stimulation in the material that we're going to offer you. So in terms of what are we covering today? Well, our agenda is to look at what self-managing teams are, and self-organizing teams, as they're sometimes called. Look at why it seems to be more important now in terms of how the world is developing and how organizations are developing. So we'll spend a little bit of time thinking about that. We'll remind ourselves or take a look at some of the key features of self-managing and self-organizing teams. What does that look like in practice? What do we need to be thinking about when we're contemplating the idea of self-management within an organizational setup? We'll deepen that a little bit further and particularly think about some of the challenges or factors that come into play here culturally and organizationally, process and structure-wise, that are worth reflecting on before simply adopting a whole new way of managing and organizing and engaging people in organizational activity. There are, thankfully, some case studies in this area, many in fact. We've picked out a few that might be interesting and that you may choose to pursue further and take more of a look at. And we'll end up by thinking about what are the benefits, so why might an organisation think about going down this road, and is it for everybody? Is this something that all organisations could or should be thinking about? So that's broadly our agenda for the session, and as I say, I plan to leave some time towards the end for anybody who's got something to say, something to add, maybe a different perspective altogether, maybe that you've been involved in or are running some trials in this area and have got some first-hand knowledge also that you want to share. In terms of our own credentials in this area, well, we work a lot with organisations around engagement, empowerment, and interestingly, empowerment is one of those words that gets used a lot, bandied around a lot, without much time or thought being given to what does that really mean, and what are some of the things that we might have to address if we were truly to take ourselves down a more empowering road, culturally, behaviourally, and in practice. So engagement and empowerment are two areas where we do quite a bit of work with organisations, and that really starts to encompass a lot of this self-managing team philosophy as well. So in terms of what do we mean by self-managing and self-organising teams, is this something new? Is this something that is part of the 21st century zeitgeist? Well, it is in one sense, but it's also been around for a while. In the current time, in these last few years, there are a couple of quite seminal books, if you will, or academics who've started to bring this phrase, this concept, back into our awareness. Isaac Getz has written a book called Corporate Liberation, an influential academic, considered to be one of the top 4 academics in Europe, talking about these types of topics. And so he really writes a lot about how to liberate organizations from some of the shackles that have served them well, but perhaps now need to be rethought. His book is actually called Freedom, Inc., which he wrote back in 2009. And Frederic Laloux is also someone that many people will have heard of. His book, Reinventing Organizations, where he looks at the concepts of teal organizations, so next generation organizations, if you will, and self-management, self-managing teams is one of the three core constructs within his thinking also. So is it a new phenomenon? Is it something that is one of those things that will come and go? Well, there's always that risk, of course. It depends whether we're ready to start embedding some of these principles. Empowerment is something, as I said, that is starting to take more of a hold. People are starting to examine what that might mean, but it's also hitting quite a lot of obstacles and challenges in that process. We're very familiar with the idea of high-performing teams, again, a phrase that can get used a lot in organizations, but not necessarily yet fully embraced and embedded to its fullest potential. And certainly when you get to thinking about self-managing or self-organizing teams, you're really trying to push those boundaries of high-performing teams further than perhaps some are traditionally used to working with. I think in answering that question also about is it new or has it been around for a while? Well, yes and no. It has been around in relative terms for a while. There was research started in the late 1940s and 50s by the Tavistock Institute in the post-war era when there was a search for greater productivity and what is it that would lead to greater productivity. And in fact, one of the areas they were studying were coal mines in Durham, where they discovered highly autonomous groups working in the coal mines and achieving quite phenomenal returns in terms of productivity. So the awareness about this idea of autonomous teams or highly autonomous teams, if not completely, it does go back quite a long way. And we are seeing business teams responding to this in a number of different ways. I mean, we're all familiar with those crises that can occur in businesses where it's all hands to the pump. And often we can see self-management operating in that sort of space. There's no time to wait for formal command structures. Something has to happen. People use their knowledge, experience, their capabilities, their talents that often go way beyond their formal job descriptions. They get in, they pitch in, they solve the problem. Startups is another area where we see quite a lot of that self-management in practice. There's less formal job descriptions. People just have to get with the program, get on with it. We also see that happening in places like emergency wards. So, in a hospital where teams are having to deal with in-the-moment situations, these are often self-managing, even though people have defined roles and functions, of course. They cooperate and collaborate in a way that is much more fluid and much more in the moment and a lot less siloed in that respect. But there are also examples where it is more systemically applied in today's world, and we'll be talking about some of those case studies shortly. But W.L. Gore, which is one of the perhaps more famous examples of self-management, have been doing this since the 1960s. We perhaps are all familiar with some of the work that was done at Volvo in the 70s, where they started to create intact teams, taking a more holistic approach to the production line and seeing increases in job satisfaction, engagement, and quality and productivity. And also an organization called SEMCO in Brazil, where they've been doing this for decades, a manufacturing, production, research, technology company that has been approaching self-management without necessarily labeling it that way as part of a core part of the way they function. One of the things that we have to think about, though, in self-management is to what extent are we ready to think about moving beyond efficiency as our only focus? Because as we know, our organizational models are largely built on that production efficiency mentality, and that lends itself to higher degrees of control. If we think about how we define this idea of self-managing? Well, this is the dictionary definition. So self-organized, semi-autonomous, small groups of employees whose members determine, plan and manage their day-to-day activities under reduced or no supervision. And here is where we hit quite a lot of the buffer. It's not the concept of people self-managing in the sense of looking after their day-to-day activity, but the idea of removing that level of supervision and supposed control is one of the Achilles heels for this approach in the organizational world. And if we look at that in a little bit more detail, what we're saying is, in order for self-management to come forward, and this model is taken from a McKinsey article around agility, in fact, but it's a very useful model for what we're looking at today. How do we move our organizations from the top-down hierarchical organizations as machines construct, the pyramid construct, the silo-based construct that we're very familiar with, and even where we have moved into flatter structures, that core DNA is still there, that top-down hierarchy still sits within our thinking, to organizations that are genuinely designed as organisms, designed in a way that allows for multiple small groups, mixed groups, to come together in a much more flexible way. As we know, within the more traditional organization, we see a heavy emphasis on things like production tasks, goal achievement, more so than innovation, high levels of supervisory control, reliance on top-down management, and a high proportion of narrow jobs, people whose jobs are quite tightly defined. When we move to this more organic or organism-based structural thinking, we focus much more on the idea of the whole process perspective of the task. So people are gathered together to be able to see end-to-end aspects of the task to be undertaken, and accountability that goes with that. There is a focus on continuous improvement and innovation, because that's built into the way the team communicate with each other and approach the task. And the teams actually control their own daily activities through group decisions. They take that responsibility within the group. But the role of the manager and the changes here to coach and facilitator. So it's not that there's a complete absence of higher level responsibility, but it comes in a different form. It comes in the form of coaching, facilitating, enabling the organization, and with an emphasis on this end-to-end accountability. Why is that important now? Why would it be coming more to the fore in these days? Why might we want to give it some consideration? Well, this is here in Azure one of our favorite slides of the day, if you will, in terms of conversations we have with organizations, because as we re-examine complexity theory and chaos theory, we can see that there is a growing chance that many of our organizations and many of the things that we're facing in organizations are taking us into the complex space. So just to briefly explain this model, what Stacey and Snowden and Boone have done in their work is look at how we approach different types of decisions, of work, of activities within an organization. And on the vertical axis, we can see the degree to which there is agreement about what needs to be done, and on the horizontal axis, the degree to which there is levels of certainty about the environment and the activity. So in many of our organizations, we have a mindset that is trying to move as much as possible to the simple space, where we are clear about the cause and effect. We know that there's a right answer. It's clear. Our experience shows us that. And we make decisions based on facts. That allows for a much higher level of production mentality, efficiency, and control. However, our world is not like that anymore. What we're noticing in the world at large is that there is a lot less linearity, a lot more uncertainty. VUCA is obviously one of the phrases of the day as well, where we have to confront the fact that we are working in a space where there are no longer right answers, that we have to experiment more, we have to test out ideas, we have to move in the moment and be more flexible. And that becomes very tricky to do when we are working with a very highly structured and highly rigid organisation mindset and approach. And indeed, the way we are approaching and defining job roles and people's contribution in the organisation. So to get the flexibility and the agility that we now need in organisations, it's really important that we connect with this idea that the world is changing at a very fast rate of knots. And it's not only changing, but there's a lot less predictability in what may come next. Not to get political, but looking at the votes and the discussions that have been going on in the last 24 hours, very difficult to predict what's happening, which way things will show up. And therefore, from an organizational point of view, being able to operate in a more flexible space requires us to think about more fundamentally how we're organized, how we are approaching the idea of empowerment, engagement, inclusion, bringing our people into the mix. So if we think about that then in terms of what are some of the features, if you will, of self-managing teams, what are the things that we might expect to see? A list here which you can all read and which I won't speak to every item on there, but just a few examples perhaps to bring it to life. Coming back to W.L. Gore, who, as I say, one of the grandfathers, I believe, of this type of philosophy and thinking. And if we think about this first point, hierarchy, often informal, based entirely on competence. There's a saying in W.L. Gore that anybody can call a meeting, that's fine. But if you call a meeting and people show up, then you can define yourself as a leader. And the point being that it's about your connection, your relationship, your communication, your influence, the way in which you approach your colleagues and your communication as part of that, your ability to be credible, that's what draws people to want to come and follow. So leadership and followership get redefined, not based on power or positional power, but much more on personal power and relationship, and clearly making sense as part of that. A couple of others there that I would pick out: goals clear and set by the team, and team members are interdependent. Morning Star, which is one of the cases that I'll come on to again a little bit further. They are a tomato grower and make products based on the agriculture around tomatoes, based in the States, and they have had for many years a situation where they create a letter of understanding between key colleagues. So colleagues will go out and create their own contract, if you will, their own letter of understanding about how they're going to show up and support each other. And that collaboration, that service agreement, if you will, between people allows for much more accountability at the level at which it really matters, peer to peer, colleague to colleague, as opposed to imposed in some top-down process. Now, I'd also like to pick out a few challenges from some of these features as well. So where we're looking at this sort of informal hierarchy or self-regulating with relatively few controls, we know that we operate in relatively autocratic cultures today in many organizations, certainly quite often in large organizations. And we have to be able to confront that mindset much more fully than perhaps we have done to date. And certainly I can recall a number of conversations with senior executives about the degree to which they are prepared to release and relinquish control as they perceive it. And it's actually quite a challenging concept because of the level of embeddedness that we have around control. Having no job titles or job descriptions can also bring quite big challenges to people's mindsets, because people like to know that they are valued for their expertise, their contribution, and so much of our organizational structure is built on valuing very particular types of expertise. And yet, if we take away that job title and job description, we have ways in which people can develop more quickly, they find themselves completely into new situations, developing new talents that they might not have otherwise done, given the boxing that can happen with more formal job descriptions and job titles. Conflict resolved amongst peers. Conflict, again, can be something that is often avoided in our current organisations. We tend to walk away from it. We tend to not give the feedback that is needed. In self-managing teams, developing the skills in conflict management is a fundamental part of the success. Being able to give feedback, being able to bring to the attention of the individual or the team as a whole the things that are getting in the way, because people are vested in the success of the work that they're doing, the project they're involved in. That's because they set their own goals and they develop their own values, not to be independent of the organizational values, but values for how they intend to and want to work. Underpinning all of this, of course, is a need for people to take a much higher level of responsibility and accountability. And so in order to be able to move into that self-managing space, we also have to think about the degree to which individuals within that team and organization are willing to take on the responsibilities that come with it. And Zappos is an interesting case study in this area. And again, Zappos is one of the archetypal case studies for the whole kind of moving to teal organization, as Frederic Laloux would talk about it. And Zappos have done many different things over the years. And not so very long ago, they decided to really embrace the self-managing teams concept fully as a fully leveraged way of working right across the organization. But they recognized that in doing that, there was still quite a few people who hadn't been able to come on the journey with them. And they set up a very extensive program to support those people and help them leave the organization, supporting them financially, supporting them educationally, supporting them in finding their next role. So the values of the organization were kept intact, and people could leave in a very healthy and respectful and positive way. And so relationships weren't broken in a fractious or damaging way. So the responsibility of moving to this type of cultural norm extends to those who can join in, but also those who can't. Which then brings us to a number of key factors that we need to perhaps think about. And I've spoken a little bit now about the personal responsibility. We have to also think about how developed are we individually and collectively? What's the level of maturity that we have, and how do we start to build that maturity more fully? We have to be able to consider how well are we fit for purpose when it comes to the principles of self-management. We have to have a willingness to really explore the parameters of empowerment and how far that goes. And at an individual level, we have to support people to developing the both emotional and mental maturity that allows them to believe that they can take this extra responsibility on. So we have to think about things like, how do we view our people? Do we really trust them? And this is a whole other interesting factor, in fact, future of a topic of a future webinar. But how do we really trust people? If we think about our policies and our systems and processes, how are they set up? Do they treat people as adults, or do they treat them as children? Are we still operating that parental model? And have we considered how we move from, if we're thinking about teaching a child to ride a bike, that idea that daddy's clinging on at the back, making sure the bike doesn't fall over or has put the stabilizers on, to the child being able to say, look, no hands, I'm doing it. I can do this on my own. That requires some planning and some intention, but also some preparation around supporting people in that process and building the level of emotional intelligence in the organization through dialogue, feedback, openness, and appropriate challenge. Which then brings us to the level of the quality of the mindset amongst management and leadership in the organization. This idea of self-managing can be very challenging for those people in positional roles of management and leadership. because there is that fundamental question that will come up. So what's my role? What am I here for? If I'm not controlling, if I'm not the decision maker, if I'm not the one who's overseeing all of this, what's my role? And here it demands a new mindset about the role, a new approach, and new skills to enable leaders to coach, to facilitate, to enable. And servant leadership is an interesting prospect here, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a second, because that also talks about the role of managers enabling an organization, not controlling it from the top down. But it also demands a willingness to let go of the identity that we have around management and leadership. And we know that in the wider world, being able to declare ourselves as a manager has a certain kudos attached to it. It says, I've climbed the ladder, I've achieved something. But we need to be able to redefine that and find a new relationship with this idea of the management and leadership role. We have to view seniority differently, less about power and control and much more about wisdom and influence. And we need to be able to choose to settle into that new identity, which I think brings us to another factor, which is around consciousness. Consciousness both in the sense of our level of awareness, but also in the sense of our breadth of thinking and our ability to think more holistically and less in a boxed fashion. So to be able to hold a bigger perspective, a bigger vista, which in itself opens us to a real commitment to growth, both personal, organizational, and community, and perhaps even humanity on a wider level. Because to take on the principles of self-management says that we believe we are all involved in this experience that we have as an organism, as an organization. And that in order to do that effectively, collaboratively, inclusively, requires us to access wisdom, to be more reflective, to be prepared to see the whole system and take different perspectives within that, and value and respect perspectives. Which links us back also to the personal development aspect. And I mentioned servant leadership and Robert Greenleaf's work back in the 70s, which again was bringing back into common consciousness the idea that actually the fundamental role of leaders is to serve, is to enable others, in organizational terms at the front line, to be as effective as they possibly can be, to remove the roadblocks and the obstacles, to be the cheerleaders, the supporters, the enablers of the organization, and to take a much broader perspective on how the organization is functioning as a whole entity. I promised some case studies, and I've mentioned a couple of these as we've gone along. Just to say a little bit more about W.L. Gore. Gore-Tex, many of you will be familiar with as a technical product. As I said, Gore have been operating in this self-managing space since the 60s and have had no managers since that time. They, another example, apart from the philosophy that you're a leader when people show up at a meeting that you've called, is that they have a peer selection process for new managers. So team leaders are selected from within the team themselves and by the team themselves. And they're very much seen to be in service of the team, not controlling the team. I mentioned Zappos, not on this slide, but just another thing to say about their philosophy from a values and cultural perspective, which also is fundamental to self-management. They have a practice which is that when they take on a new hire, they make a commitment to pay that new hire $3,000 if they quit during the onboarding process, which extends over a number of months. And they do this because they are committed to making sure that they get the perfect fit culturally. And they want people to be able to leave in good humor, good spirit, and not feel they have to stay because they need the job. And the $3,000 cushions that process. And they experimented with this, starting first at $100 and increasing it over time as they found the optimal sum of money that allows them to ensure they keep people whose fit culturally enables them to build the sort of organization that they want. Morningstar, a farm that produces tomatoes, they have two principles within their kind of cultural management practice. The first is that everybody should be able to work without any use of force brought about on them by another person in any way, shape or form. So there should be no coercion, no forcing people to do anything. And the other fundamental principle that they work to is that everybody should honour their commitment. So if I make a commitment, I honour it. Again, that principle of self-responsibility and accountability. 3M have had self-directed teams since 1984 in their manufacturing plants. People are driven by taking initiative rather than corporate directive, and they've seen a 300% gain in productivity in one plant alone as they started to adopt this in the early days. People are empowered to take corrective action locally at source as they need to, and they have access to all the information they need to help them plan, control and improve their operations locally. And Buurtzorg is a healthcare provider in the Netherlands, originated in the Netherlands, and their focus is very much on really living their clear purpose, passionately committed to their clear purpose, which is around enabling people to collaborate around providing the highest possible healthcare, moving beyond any sense of competition in a privatized health market. And they facilitate the building of multidisciplinary nursing and care teams and enabling them to collaborate and self-manage. And this model is being adopted in some NHS facilities in the UK now, some experimenting with small teams, small self-managing teams. So this is it's not new in that sense. And you know, over a number of decades, we're seeing self-management coming very much onto the radar. What are some of the benefits? Well, hopefully they're starting to become self-evident, but for sure, all the reported benefits suggest much happier workforce, much higher performance levels, lower turnover, because the right people are in, much more emphasis on shared values and enabled teams that ultimately lead to higher quality and also cost reduction. That there's an investment in growth and people are actually much more resourced than they are in the more defined and delineated job roles of our traditional organisations, again leading to an increased retention of good talent. Much more emphasis on I can rather than I can't. People genuinely feel they can go and solve something and they're going to be supported in that process. Even if it's the wrong action or the wrong decision, it's seen as a learning process. This builds greater innovation and greater commitment amongst the team members and workers. But it also has benefits in this whole area of agility and flexibility. More flexibility in product design, development, solutions are much more easily found, and newer, more innovative solutions. But also the speed with which the organisation can respond. If you think about that multiple set of small circular teams as opposed to working your way through the inefficiencies of a top-down autocratic structure. There are cost reduction benefits, less inefficiencies or more efficiency. Many organisations taking out a number of management grades. So often we hear about that sort of really stuck middle management grade. This really removes a lot of that inertia that can form in that area. And as I said, more innovation that leads to both quality and cost benefits. AT&T, another example of someone adopting the self-management principles in some areas, have seen an increase in the quality of their service operators of over 12%. And FedEx have been able to cut service errors by 13%. So there are hard metrics in this area too. And just as I'm finishing up, before I open up for any comments or contributions anybody else would like to make, is this for everyone? Do we all need to go down the same path? Well, I think we need to come back and think about that Stacey and Snowden and Boone work on chaos and complexity theory, and look at the degree to which our organisation operates more fully, legitimately, in that simple production mindset space, and that's right, we've got a lot of simple tasks, they don't need lots of reinventing every 5 minutes, then of course there's no point in putting in a whole new system of working. So that certainly does need to be considered. We also need to consider the degree to which we can shift some of the management mindsets. Is that something we can do, we want to do? Have we got the energy to put that in? We also need to consider the inertia that might exist in the broader employee base. What proportion of people are sitting in the organisation thinking, you know, I'm not paid to think, I really don't want this. But the question here might be, do we know the answer to that? Have we tested that? Have we put the experiments in place that attract those who are ready to take on a broader role? We need to also identify where those role models might be at all levels, top to bottom, as it's currently structured in the organisation. We probably need to think about starting small and following the Buurtzorg approach being adopted in the NHS in that experimental sense. And we also need to think about the way in which the world is moving and ask ourselves the question, can we afford not to? And that's not because I'm saying everybody has to, but we do owe it to ourselves to say, can we afford not to? So self-management is going through a regeneration, I would say, self-managing teams. And I think any organisation would do well to give it serious consideration and perhaps even take that first step into experimentation.